5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Hey space enthusiasts, my guest this week is Bessie Schwarz, the CEO and co-founder of cli-fi, a company that uses satellite imagery and other data to come up with better flood models for customers like governments and insurance companies. Hence, it is an example of the use of space technology for something useful right here on Earth, which is something we always like. Please enjoy my conversation with Bessie. My name is Raphael Rodkin, and I'm an investor and advisor to space companies. Just as a reminder, this podcast is for informational purposes only, and nothing should be taken as investment advice. This podcast is sponsored by NanoAvionics, a satellite manufacturer and mission integrator. Their technologies enable many space companies worldwide to offer services that improve life right here on Earth, such as providing global connectivity, conducting Earth observation, or contributing to scientific discoveries. Check them out, and also check out my episode with the CEO and co-founder. Sadly, I am not a rocket scientist, but I'm an alumnus of the International Space University. ISU offers a number of educational programs about space worldwide. Check them out at isunet.edu. And just some final things before we start the episode about ourselves. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, such as Apple or Spotify. If you want us help expand our work, you can do so and support us at www.patreon.com/Space Business Podcast, and we'll also put that link in the episode notes. And lastly, you can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. Hey, welcome back, everybody. It's time for another episode, and I'm really thrilled because this episode is about what we would call the downstream market. And since we're a non-technical podcast, let me quickly remind you, downstream is basically, as opposed to upstream would be stuff like hardware, rockets, satellites, satellite constellations. Downstream is basically a lot about using space data, and it could also be space communications, but let's say space data, in order to achieve useful things right here on Earth. And in that vein, we have Bessie Schwarz here, the CEO and co-founder of cli-fi. Welcome, Bessie.
It's great to be here.
Great. It's great to have you. Bessie, should we start as usual? And I'm going to ask you to give us the sort of 1 or 2 minute elevator pitch on cli-fi, please.
Yeah, sure thing. Well, it's pretty simple. So cli-fi is really the authority on tracking flooding globally and in near real time, using all remote methods, primarily satellites, but actually not exclusively satellites. And essentially what we're doing is just scanning the Earth every day to look for any kind of unusual water and any severe water. And then we take that living map of flooding back in time in order to understand patterns of flood risk as they're changing for virtually any pixel on Earth, which enables us to also look forward into future flood risk without any ground equipment, equally accurately everywhere around the world. We've been actually developing this as science for almost 10 years. My co-founder and I have been working together, going on our 10-year anniversary, and started originally in partnership with Google. But today we've been partnering primarily with the public sector in about 28 countries around the world, mostly helping with search and rescue, disaster management, risk reduction, and with global insurers and reinsurers around the world in order to offer what's called parametric flood insurance in order to cover lots of uncovered flood risk out there, to meet it with a financial social safety net that it doesn't have today as flood risk grows and chases. Interestingly enough, on this podcast, while really a lot of our roots are in remote sensing and satellites, we consider ourselves a flood intelligence platform and a climate insurance platform. And we actually today leverage a lot of terrestrial data, including physically based models, gauges that are hooked up on IoT, and lots of information on the ground in order to inform the AI intelligence that we're using in order to detect floods around the world. And that's what gives us a continuous flood map and fills all gaps that are left behind by the direct observations. And really happy to get into that. But I think the thing that I'm really proudest of in many ways is that today we're monitoring through governments on the platform of almost 400 million people who are vulnerable around the world. And the public sector has really helped upgrade, especially in places that are the most climate vulnerable around the world, and now are enabling people by the hundreds of thousands in order to get access to insurance that they were never able to have before. We believe that this is truly an essential layer if we're going to adapt to the amount of climate shocks that are coming.
Yeah. Okay. So that's great. That's a lot to unpack here. But let me first ask you,
Do it.
how did you decide to do this? I mean, I don't know. Did you like grow up in New Orleans and Katrina hit, or is there some sort of story behind it, or why floods?
Yeah. Well, floods. So at a very high level, floods are the worst climate shock. They're the worst natural disaster. They're actually more than all other disasters combined in terms of the amount of economy exposed and the number of people impacted. So you have stack fires, landslides, earthquakes all on top of each other. You don't meet the amount of threat that flooding presents to the global economy and people around the world. And so when we looked at that, and then we looked at how relatively, for the size of the problem, inaccurate flood data is today, I'll go into that in a second, it was quite obvious that this was the place to go disrupt. But my co-founder and I really understood this problem firsthand before we began a journey to build this new method and science around it. My background was working on policy with climate vulnerable communities in the US, primarily in Midwest and in Florida, kind of all over the country. And I really saw, this is going back a long time ago, I really saw firsthand what it meant for a community, a business, an economy, to not have the information that they needed in order to help just reduce the amount of risk they have today or get capital after a disaster. My co-founder was working in a very different context, but had a very similar realization. She was in international in El Salvador doing field work when a major hurricane hit a couple of her field sites, and communities in those sites were left off of disaster aid lists because they weren't predicted to be in the flood path. And then because of local corruption, they didn't have the information to fight back and say, we deserve to be on these lists. So we both knew what it meant to not have access to this kind of information when we went to Yale. Long story short, Google basically came to Yale while Beth and I were learning the more traditional disaster modeling methods, and showed an extremely early version of Google Earth Engine, which I'm sure your audience knows about. But this was like no error messages, basically. And it was like right when they had really done it, and they were essentially asking Yale professors to start writing papers at the planetary scale. But Beth and I really saw from that a new way was possible for disaster science, that we suddenly could analyze anywhere on Earth and have accurate data in the communities I had worked with, the communities she had worked with, and everywhere else around the world.
Okay, so walk us through the product a little bit. So you basically, you're basically building a model, if I understood correctly.
Yeah.
Right? And this is a model to, is it to predict the risk of flooding or to assess the damage post an event, or both?
Yeah, so we do what's called the full disaster cycle. So there's the before the event happens, just where's the risk in my community? How risky is my home across my country? Right before the event happens, where is it going to go? Do we need to evacuate, take some clear action while it's happening, response, and then recovery. So we provide information for the full disaster cycle. And we do that. It's a different version of the technology, but in many ways, the same underlying approach or methods. Before the event, we have flood risk maps that are all direct observation based. They're all from just looking at where floods have been over time. And then we can use that to predict likelihood of floods going forward for different areas around the world. That is fundamentally different than the traditional way of modeling flood risk. Just to give listeners kind of a sense of it, the traditional way, which is a very good science, and we deeply respect our colleagues who do traditional hydrology, what they do is put ground equipment all throughout a watershed, get the stream gauge, the stream levels over time, get the elevation, and then force simulate water through that in a couple of different scenarios, just to see where water would flow in the event of different types of flooding. It can be very, very good, but it's highly dependent on that information that's going into the model being accurate. If you don't know that actually the city changed its sewage system and the drainage system over here is a little bit different, you're going to predict the water flows in a different way than it does. We don't care about any of that. We just look at where the water has been over time and use that direct observation as a way to understand how the watershed is changing and where things have actually been. And so our approach to flood risk has been proven to be more accurate for some kinds of flooding than the traditional model. We actually see it very much as in complement. But that's used for the disaster management or disaster risk reduction part of disaster response. We then turn the forward-looking mode into what we do that's able to say where floods are about to be. We have a couple of different versions of that. We're very excited to launch a new version in the US pretty soon, actually. And then we have just the direct monitoring of where things are happening. And what we're doing there is just looking for flooding and then overlaying that with assets that the government or the insurer or the corporate cares about and alerting them to what's going on. We have a dashboard. They can watch the floods as they're happening. And then in recovery, it's really looking at things like, have the farms been able to replant? Are the roads still blocked and damaged and things like that?
Right. So let me maybe use a specific example and one that I know well. So I'm originally from Germany, and I'm, as you obviously know, because of what you're doing, we had these absolutely horrendous floods. I think it's about a couple of years ago, right? It even cost the potential chancellor, I think, the election because he was seen laughing at the flooding side, but that's a different story. Horrendous floods, if people don't know, it happened in the middle of Germany. I think they killed like hundreds of people. I mean, it was an absolute shock event because people were like, why is this? How can this happen in one of the most developed nations in the world? So kind of bringing this back to your work, was this, for example, was this bad modeling? Was this like modeling was good, but people were having homes in like reckless locations? Or kind of what was your view, if you have one, of like what happened in that specific example?
Yeah. Okay. I don't know that specific example. I know I'm much more familiar with the floods that happened last summer because we were helping some of our customers respond to those. But when we talk about flooding, we're actually talking about many different things. So a riverine or river overbank happens in a very different way than sea surge or hurricane or just heavy downpour, or a dam breaks or there's some kind of human intervention that leads to a massive amount of water. So it could be a variety of different things. And some of these are much easier to predict than others. For instance, a human intervention failing that's not a hydrologic driven event in many ways. So depending on what it was, it could have been more or less easy to predict, which then drives to the question of, were people in dangerous places and could that have been predicted, and what is actually that zoning? And I will tell you that, so we released a paper that was on the cover of Nature about a year and a half ago that looked at direct observations of flooding over the past several decades in order to understand trends of flood exposure and how it's been evolving. And not surprisingly, we found huge trend, like a lot more flood risk growing pretty steeply. We actually found about 86 million more people were exposed to floods than had been previously known. Models had left out these 86 million people that had been experienced by floods. But really interestingly, that was driven fairly equally by changes in the floodplain growing, and humans moving into the floodplain. So we're actually experiencing really both right now. And it's not just climate change that's increasing the amount of just present day disaster risk we have. And so to come back to kind of your question here in Germany, in many ways, that gives me a lot more hope than you might think, is that we have it in our control through good disaster management to greatly reduce the amount of risk that we have today. So we'd have to take a look at the exact example that we're looking at here, or more likely what I would want to do is look at every flood in Germany, which we've done, over time, and then take a look at comparing, like, is there unplanned or even planned poor development in places where we just know it's going to flood again.
Because that's interesting. I mean, how do you sense is sort of the, I guess, public awareness of that? Because if I understand correctly, probably your models, you could probably, I don't know where you have this, but it sounds like even like I could type in a zip code and it would tell me like, well, if you buy a house there, that's risky, less risky. And, you know, I've bought many properties in my life, and I must admit, I've actually never done this or checked this. Even I think when I bought a property once in Miami Beach, and I sort of in the back of my head thought, okay, maybe in 20 years, this might not be a good idea, but is this something that you can do right now? And is there a product? Are people using this sort of for real estate purchases or real estate owners? Or
yeah, so Clouter Street primarily doesn't serve the general public or even small businesses. We
B2B
primarily
and B2G, I guess.
Exactly, and pretty large versions. So we're mostly doing national governments. We do large state governments as well, and large corporations that have a significant amount of climate risk or portfolios of climate risk. So maybe a collective of farmers or a bank that hold a lot of farmer risk. So they'll come back to your question there, because there are great folks out there that we really respect who do exactly what you're talking about. Clouter Street is really focused on the much larger kind of higher kind of commercial transaction level work, where we're doing insurance policies that are, you know, sometimes tens of millions of dollars for the premium, and operate really at a much deeper level within that economy. But there's a really great organization, I believe it's a nonprofit, called First Street Foundation that does that. Leverages a lot of, or built off of Fathom's flood map. It's a hydrology company we really respect. They've inserted their flood risk, I believe they call it flood factor, into Zillow, which is a
real estate website.
Exactly, yeah. So it really encourages people to consider flooding when making a home purchase.
Okay, understood. Okay, so let's say, you know, I'm regional or national government or sort of a corporate with a very large, potentially vulnerable real estate portfolio of warehouses or production facilities or whatever.
Exactly. Now you got it.
Okay, good. So I come to Clouter Street, and what do I actually buy? Is it sort of like a subscription to a model? Is it sort of like a periodical report? Or is it an actual insurance product? Are you guys actually doing insurance products yourself, or what is it that I buy?
Yeah, let's start with insurance. So we work with insurers. We do not sell insurance directly ourselves. We're a data platform, or a market-wide data platform that some of the largest insurers and reinsurance are using right now in order to transact what's called parametric insurance, which is a very different kind of insurance. It's where the insurance triggers based on a parameter having been detected rather than someone coming and appraising the damage of your property or your asset. So we sell to all insurers. It's a market wide, and they use our data set in order to price premiums. So to actually structure the insurance policy for flood insurance for, you know, let's say a collective of farmers across an entire country, they can say, okay, this is going to be, you know, X premium for each of these farmers, and then once all of that's negotiated and the consumers are buying the policies, whether it's tons of farmers, thousands of farmers, or whether it's one government or one corporation, once that policy is in effect, we are then monitoring the asset every day, usually for about 3 years or so, and that's usually about the length of the insurance policies that we support.
Okay, and so the insurance policies are done by your insurance partners.
Yep.
I guess one sort of, interesting question on the strategy side is I have people, you know, I've spoken to people who have thought about basically trying to do the insurance products themselves. But obviously having an insurance company in the background, because for listeners who don't know, insurance is in most countries a very heavily regulated activity.
Yep.
But I guess you could develop, in some countries it's called like you can be a general agent.
An MGA is what you're thinking. Yeah.
An MGA. It's like, I didn't want to use like too much acronyms, but yeah.
Yeah. So for your audience, a MGA is essentially where you can write insurance policies, but it's not your bank account. It's the insurer's bank account. And so it's called using someone else's paper, but it looks and feels to the actually policyholder, to the end customer, like you are their insurer. So Lemonade is one that folks may be familiar with here. We considered at the very beginning quite seriously becoming an MGA. So saying, okay, we have this data that can see flood more accurately in many ways, and we can most reliably detect floods around the world. So we're able to get huge amounts of flood risk covered under insurance. We should just go do that ourselves and keep more of a percentage of the premium. And then we really looked around and at the analysis of what it would look like, and between us doing that versus us helping everyone, offering our data to everyone, enabling everyone to do parametric flood insurance. And there were two really concrete reasons. First is money. We can there's much bigger of a market if we're going at the estimated about $140 billion potential parametric insurance market. And we're enabling everyone to transact or enter that market, and everyone is using this data set for it. So it's sort of like being something like Stripe, where we enable a huge amount of value to happen, and we just take a small transaction fee for everybody who's doing Stripe, enabling transactions on the internet, and in this case, enabling flood insurance. Yeah. The second reason is impact. So we are very much a public benefit corporation, and we're driven quite a bit by the mission to make sure all communities are able to prepare and respond to climate disasters. And so we are very much focused on this mission. We think we can reach scale much more effectively, much more sustainably by enabling the large capital providers in the world in order to protect and build the safety net that we need to really within the next 10 years or so.
Okay, and what the benefits to the insurers and the community is, is probably two, right? So by having more accurate data, you're improving the pricing of insurance where it may already exist. And it sounds like you're also enabling insurance in regions where it may not have existed before because the insurance companies weren't comfortable that there was enough data. Is that it?
It's much more the latter. You've hit it on the nose with the latter. So we are not, well, in many ways, a parametric approach that we enable can be more transparent. It certainly can be faster. It has lots of advantages. We're not attempting to switch over the about $30 billion of flood insurance premium that's done with more traditional methods, modeling, and then the person coming to your door. We're really focused on the 75% of flood losses that cannot be covered today around the world, and even in pockets in the US and Europe where there's a fairly robust flood insurance market. And so when we come to an insurer, we're saying, this is all going after a new revenue. We're not a new cost for you. This isn't a cheaper way of, doing the same thing. Yeah. This is all going after and expanding your market and getting lots of good flood risk out there and important flood risk out there that you just can't access through the traditional means.
Okay. So I would interpret that. So you're probably less likely to operate, let's say, in, Florida or something.
Correct.
Okay. That was an easy guess, I guess. And then on the other side, is there one or two interesting examples of new regions your methodology opened up?
Yeah, and so I should say we're not interested in, let's say, homeowners insurance in Florida. It really is the convergence of, we don't do this sort of much smaller, more disaggregated level of risk where you're really dependent on marketing and selling and distribution, and then really competitive markets where, frankly, there's a huge amount of already correlated risk for insurance customers in those locations. But we would be, and actually are in conversation about doing a lot of different kinds of insurance in the Gulf Coast. And this is mostly doing hurricane, adding a flood layer into an already existing hurricane, which is a fairly robust parametric insurance market today, but is all done based on wind. So when you buy a parametric hurricane, it's all wind damage, which is important. But the last several major hurricanes primarily have led to damage from water, not from wind or rainfall. And so that's the layer that we add. So we do large sort of municipalities or corporates in some of those environments, which just do not have. The theme here is that we go after and help with things that are just not done today or not possible today. So what I just described there is a sort of ideal case for us. It would be, again, be large corporations or kind of large policies. We also are doing, one of our favorite things to do is national level insurance, so sovereign, either in the form of direct insurance policies that would be held by the national government. So in the US, the National Flood Insurance Program has a reinsurance that's triggered in a similar way. And then in many of the countries that are using our platform for disaster management are now also being brokered or sold flood insurance on the same technology that they're using for disaster management. They're using our platform for what they normally would be doing, and then insurers can offer payouts when those major disasters happen using the exact same data that we have. And this can be done in two different ways. One, a direct policy payout. So what you would normally be used to, a major event happens like that flood in Germany you were just talking about, and then the German government gets an immediate large influx of cash triggered automatically. So basically within a week or less, they would get this amount of money, and that would power all the things you need to do in order to protect your citizenry and bounce back quickly. The second form is, I think, extremely interesting, and that's in the form of debt relief. This is really important for countries that I think are extremely vulnerable to climate change and have less borrowing power. So this is where, similar thing, we detect a national event happens based on some predetermined parameter, and then instead of getting the actual cash, they just get their loans relieved in part or in full. So they don't have to choose then between going further into debt or defaulting and doing a response.
Okay. I assume those would be loans not with private lenders, but with like IMF or something like that, right?
It can be both, actually.
Really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so I guess that means you guys are not only operating in the US. Have you done deals with sort of like other countries, other sovereigns, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're a fully global company. The platform is fully accurate everywhere on Earth. And then we've always been global. The first country we worked with was India. Well, I guess the first country was the US, and then the second was India, and we've been all over the world since then.
Okay. And just coming back to the parametric part, I forgot to ask, but now you've talked about things like, winds and versus floods and so forth. I mean, what is actually the typical sort of parametric trigger you use? Is it sort of like water, like rainfall, water levels, wind speed, a combination?
Yeah, so we use a combination of things. So the primary thing, and the thing that is really we've found is the most reliable, so the most correlated with damage, and that correlation between your parameter and damage is the most important thing when doing parametric insurance. We just look at water on the ground. So it'll be something like a fractional flooded area for the jurisdiction. So let's say it's a farm or a municipality or an entire country done by county or something like that. So we just look at actual observed water on the ground. Did the event visibly happen? We will add in all kinds of what's called second triggers or a blended trigger that will be other. So you could say rainfall, wind, all these other elements. Frankly, those are they're easier to monitor than the direct floods on the ground, but they're incredibly useful as backups and for certain kinds of terrain where the direct observation may have a gap in looking at the flood.
Okay. And so your models, are they based on, it sounds like they're based on probably a combination of historical data where it's available and then sort of, like you said, ongoing observation?
Yeah, exactly. So what we do is basically harness a whole bunch of different satellites that are circling the Earth all the time. And it's actually really important that we have, for the sake of insurance, primarily we use orbiting satellites because we know that insurer really needs to know this is going to look at this spot at the same time every day. They care about reliability in many ways more than accuracy in some ways. So we're generally using a variety of just orbiting satellites and then fusing them together and going back in time to look at the likelihood that an event has happened in that location. That's what we use for pricing. So the insurers we work with actually care less about the maps themselves and the resolution and all of that, what they really need to focus on is the probability curves of an event. And that's how we set the trigger. And so I do think this is something I feel strongly sometimes about the space industry world. I love it. And in many ways is kind of my original home. We need to think about the mode in which our actual customers are consuming information. Because while we love maps, they might not even care about maps, even if they are providing the information. Our users just want pretty boring statistics. I mean, I think they're exciting, but boring statistics and an API that, they can tap into with a CSV at the end, pretty simple table at the end of the day. So that's what we are providing to them in order to structure the policies. And then what we do is set trigger levels. So they want to pay out or relieve the debt when X has happened, this much water is detected, et cetera. And we set that. And then we're just sending them the CSV every day to say, this is the level in these locations. And when we hit a trigger level, then we kind of activate. Here's the payout, it's ready to pay out now.
Yeah, and you hit on a point which is, very close to my heart and I find very important, which I sometimes describe it that I feel like there is still a lot of, let's call it friction between space data and how it can be made useful on Earth.
Completely.
And so friction in various ways. So let me ask you about your experience.
Yeah.
One level of friction could be sort of like, okay, so you probably work with several satellite providers, I'm guessing.
Yep, absolutely.
Because there's government, obviously EO satellites, there's then commercial providers like, Planet or Satellogic and so forth.
Love them all.
Exactly, you love them all. So you kind of, the first thing is you have to fuse probably a ton of data.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that that's easy enough at the moment, or could it be easier, or how is that experience of working with space data and using a process? Yeah,
technically, or just working the creating the relationships to.
Well, I'm hoping. Well, I don't know. I'm hoping creating the relationships that the let's say the commercial companies are probably happy to sell. I meant more so technically, sort of like, okay, how do I get the space data and feed it into my model? Is that a relatively frictionless?
Yeah. It's certainly difficult. I guess the reason we've been at this for a really long time.
You've suffered through it already, yes.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, you're always upgrading. And I actually think, we started, Beth, my co-founder, and I started doing this in 2013 or so. So the kind of it was, I think, really as planetary scale and cloud computing was really meeting the large repositories of government data. But there have been massive strides, I think, since then have made it possible. And I think the computer vision, the leaps we've made in computer vision and AI applied to satellite imagery have been, I think, huge in terms of increasing accuracy and our ability to fuse and, I think, get more scientific quality information out of satellites. And so, it's certainly very difficult. And we're really proud of the work that our team has done. And I think that kind of the switching, sort of having everything in computer vision has made it possible to do a lot more than we've ever been able to do before.
Okay. And then I guess, so the other point of friction, which a lot of companies that are struggling with, companies that want to use space data to do something useful on Earth, like you guys are doing, is that it requires a certain level of, let's call it, interdisciplinary competence.
Oh, yeah.
Because you need to, on one hand, for example, you need to understand, okay, I need data from space. Okay, who's providing? What kind of sensors are there? What kind of how do I fuse that? And then on the other end, it's sort of like, okay, I want to sell to, for example, insurance companies. Okay, well, how do I talk to an insurance company?
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head in many ways of where I think the industry should and frankly is starting to really go. And that's kind of deep verticalization. And by deep, I mean all the way from deeply understanding the remote sensing science all the way to getting really deeply embedded into the workflows, the mental models of all of the industries that can benefit from Earth observation information. So just sticking on the technical side, you need a massive amount of interdisciplinary technical expertise just to even make sense of the data and create something new. We always say, it's really not that hard to make one somewhat accurate flood map. In fact, we provide the largest database of free flood maps for free and open. That's just on our site. Because one map of that German flood or one map of Hurricane Katrina is actually fairly easy. What's really difficult is doing it accurately every day in any location such that you can rely on it for underwriting or critical search and rescue, things like that. And that really requires not just understanding satellite data, so remote sensing scientists, but understanding the underlying phenomena that you're analyzing. So we have a lot of hydrologists on our team.
Yeah.
We're trained in modeling and then moved over to sort of machine learning, and they're telling us like what we're actually looking at. And then we have machine learning experts who know how to take both of those things and actually run fantastic models on that. And then obviously we have other types of scientists. So that's just on the technical side of things. And then on the other side, we have folks who come from the insurance industry who frankly had been brokering parametric or designing and underwriting parametric policies for years and just got sick of not being able to write policies or broker policies for their customers for the largest peril out there. We're just sort of all sitting around covering insurance, knowing that it's only ever going to be half of all the catastrophes if we can't more accurately cover flooding from parametric means. And so we have folks who are kind of meeting on the other side, and they had the problem that we are ultimately trying to serve. And we've got folks on the government side as well. And it really is a kind of a coming together and really learning from one another in order to create something that's fundamentally new.
Right. And when you talk to the insurance customers, I mean, do you even mention that the space stuff? Because I mean, some part of me feels sometimes it's better not even mention it because it may scare people.
Yeah. We don't actually find that insurers are scared of the satellites, but we do find it actually can be a distraction, as you're saying, in many ways. And the important thing with insurers is you can't pull the wool over. I mean, the folks we work with are incredibly smart and incredibly good scientists, technical, and you can't, nor should you, pull the wool over their eyes. It's a pretty collaborative process when we first work with a new insurance company to help figure out the statistics they need, how they like to underwrite, the kinds of things they're underwriting. And so we'll spend 2 months, like really just scientist to scientist, working with them, taking their feedback. And they need to know everything that's going in there. But if you just handed the maps over, we wouldn't get where we need to go. And so what we actually did over the last year was build actuarial tools on top of the remote sensing and the geospatial data that we have, which make it much easier to have these conversations with insurers. We kind of put it into the statistics that they need to see. It just happens to be a different type of data feed that's creating the statistics.
But at the end of the day, you basically speak their language, right? And
you got 100%.
Fit into their business process,
100%.
explain how you add value specifically to their business. And some of that happens to come from space data, but kind of who cares from their point of view, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's just like this incredible new means to an end, but you have to stay focused on what the ultimate end value is for your customer. And if that happens to be the coolest, sweetest, new cutting edge model in CVPR, great. If it happens to be a much simpler, more boring thing, who cares? Like, we just got to enable our users to do what they need to do. And it's sort of like the tried and true, like, build it and they will come, create some exciting science and someone will surely want it. And that doesn't recognize that even if they did want that thing that you built, maybe they wouldn't even understand what it is or appreciate because you're not enabling them to consume it in the way that makes sense for them.
Yeah. So this whole market, I mean, it's kind of funny or tricky because I guess you guys are opening, like you said, a whole lot of new markets in a way.
Yeah.
How big do you think this market can be, sort of like rough order of magnitude?
Yeah. So taking the flood parametric market, we estimate it to be about $140 billion in terms of untapped premium today.
Insurance premiums. Okay.
Yep, that's right. That would be specifically for parametric that remote sensing methods or remote satellite-based methods can be most effective for.
140 billion of sort of additional premium that don't exist as revenue today.
Correct.
Okay, and roughly how much revenue is there for existing flood insurance?
Oh, today it's about 30 billion through traditional.
Okay, so wow. Okay, so you're talking about sort of more than quadrupling that, basically.
Well, yeah. So today, about 75% of flood losses are not covered. So all damage from flooding just is not protected through insurance. So it actually is the vast majority.
Okay, and then you guys, in terms for providing your, well, I was going to say your models, but really your insights, I guess I should say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You guys, is it sort of, how does that work? Is it sort of like a flat fee, or is it sort of like are you able to get sort of a percentage of premiums, or how?
Yeah. Okay. Great question. You had asked this earlier, actually. So it's different for the what we call risk holders right now, primarily governments, and for the insurers who are transacting on top. So for the risk holders, it's a flat fee that's usually annual, or they're buying multi-year over a course of many rainy seasons or hurricane seasons. So that's a much more typical business model in the geospatial industry. It is a flat fee for all services and scales if there's a ton of data that is going into it. So generally that means extremely large areas. But very simple. On the insurance side, very simple as well, but a totally different model. It's a percent of premium. And that is really important for our customers. And actually is a pretty unique thing that Cloud2Street can offer, because it is actually because we built this model already, and because we use commercial imagery when needed, but we are able to spread that out quite a bit over the course of our full customer base. And so the product is not that expensive to deploy, which means that we can say we're just doing a revenue share with insurers. So you're going to go out, we're going to enable you to get all of this new revenue, and we will win, when you actually successfully go build that market.
Align yourselves.
Yeah, we really see ourselves as building this new market that's, I think, just taking off alongside of the insurance industry, the insurers, reinsurers, and brokers.
Okay, so I guess you partly answered this question already because we were talking about the revenue sizes, but so how far along do you think Cloud2Street is in its potential journey? Sort of where do you see this journey going, also in terms of, I don't know, potential additional products or product modifications? I guess where do you see the company in 5 to 10 years, whatever the right time frame is?
Yeah, I mean, so we've been around for a while because we really wanted to make sure that our science was not just well validated, but was validated by the scientific community. So we published quite a bit in peer-reviewed journals. That was really important to us before we then went and scaled. That said, we're at the very beginning of our journey. While we've been we're really proud of everything we've done, and we've really been proven to help governments around the world leapfrog into kind of modern day resilience that can handle climate shocks. The flood parametric market, which is the way to meet this crisis with capital, with critical disaster capital, that's really just starting to take off. And we're incredibly excited and going to be quite focused on that in the kind of a near term. But yeah, I think we're just at the very beginning of our journey. And we are dead set focused on building the climate adaptation market. Period. We believe in many ways that the climate crisis is a financial crisis, that we actually do have the amount of money to fund the solutions and absorb the amount of risk that's just baked into the atmosphere today. We're just not distributing it effectively to reduce risk and to provide the capital folks need to bounce back quickly, rather than going into poverty or reducing the GDP of their government. And so we are focused over the long term on enabling all climate adaptation finance to happen globally through a variety of products like debt relief that we just talked about, enabling vulnerable countries to borrow in order to address this, to enable development capital to happen in a more effective and efficient way, to enable buyouts to happen. Even just in the US, you need to prove repeat flooding in order to get a buyout for the government to give you the money to rebuild and go to a less climate vulnerable place. We hope to provide products around that. And so we have our eyes set on a whole suite of types of finance and then other resilience actions that climate and flood intelligence can enable in the next decade.
When you're looking at sort of what you're doing, where do you believe lies your greatest, let's call it competency? Is it sort of like, it could be, I don't know, it could be proprietary data sources, but I mean, you're using, I guess, some satellite data, which anybody could buy. Is it sort of better modeling? Is it better is it like translating the modeling into insights for the customers? Is it a bit of all of the above?
Yes. Probably is a bit of all of the above. And I'll point out a couple of things. So while we have the most advanced flood tracking algorithms for remote sensing, as I mentioned earlier, we're actually fusing that with a lot of non-satellite-based data sources. And so taking advantage of the full suite of big data information we have about the Earth now, and that continues to kind of deepen our technical mode and what the just core flood mapping technology is that we have. Behind a lot of that is the largest database of flood mapping in the world. So I mentioned that we released a portion of it for free. That is a tiny fraction of what we actually have. We've been collecting that for about 6 years through a variety of means, including our government search and rescue folks on the ground, helping detecting and doing ground truth data that you can't go back and ground truth a flood that happened 3 years ago. So we've got that has enabled us to just train the best models. And then I agree with you that just creating the tools, so the underwriting tools on top of our data layer, and then creating the instrument, the financial instruments alongside the insurance industry that's enabled us to embed ourselves deeply within this sector is, I think, a pretty huge advantage. Yeah.
So in terms of, I think quite a few of our listeners are potential entrepreneurs. So another question that also comes up very often is about, the whole financing side. I guess, luckily for you, you are different from some of the other companies you have on the podcast, like the upstream, the hardware companies. Some of them need a lot of money.
Yeah.
At least you probably need less money than them because you're not building satellites or rockets. But so how is sort of the financing? How have you financed the business?
Yeah, so we actually we're really proud that we bootstrapped the business for a really long time. And so the government work, we actually had, Beth and I were students, and our kind of founding team member Colin Doyle as well. We just had governments that were coming to us and basically saying, we don't have a robust hydromet system, or maybe our hydromet system got literally blown out. There's hydrology meteorology, which is like rainfall and little like equipment throughout your watershed, got blown out and we haven't been able to rebuild, or it's going to take us many years to rebuild. Could you just map our country in the meantime? We'd be like, we'll set it up in a week. So we had customers kind of coming to us because there was clearly such a need in countries all around the world. So we bootstrapped that for a long time. Then about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, we felt like the flood parametric market was ready, and we raised venture capital for a very specific reason, and that was to build the underwriting technology that I was just describing a little bit of before. And that took a decent amount of resources, not as much as it would cost to launch a satellite into space, but relatively a decent amount of resources in order to build this new type of science, these new tools. And so we raised that money, and took about a year to build that technology, and then emerged with a technology today that insurers are underwriting very large amounts of flood risk premium on top of. So we love our invest. I do think it's a topic that I could talk about for a late time, is finding the right investors for you, making sure that you're matching the expectations for the right moment of your business. But we're thrilled with the folks that we work with on the VC side.
Well, given I'm a VC as well, I'm sure we could talk for hours about this, but let's maybe try to do it in 2 minutes. It's unfair.
Okay, great. Let's do it.
One question I do want to ask you about is sort of like, because you brought up this question, who are the right investors? And again, sort of one of the fascinating things about businesses like yours is that they have this interdisciplinary angle, right? So you could, when you draw up your target investor list, right, you could have said, part of your business, you're like, let's make some space investors who know about the satellites. Or like, but really we're selling to insurance companies. Let's go to investors who understand insurtech. Or like, but it's a data product. Let's go to if you guys thought about it in that way, like how did you guys think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely thought about it as a portfolio of partners. And I think it's smart for insurers for entrepreneurs to be thinking about really who's going to be around the table when things get a little bit tough or when there's big questions, and who do you want making those decisions with you, or really, really importantly, is telling you when there's a decision you didn't realize you had to make or something you needed to be aware of. And so we really thought of it as a portfolio. So what we really prioritized during our seed round, which was led by Collaborative Fund, like a very experienced seed fund, just very successful at betting on early stage companies, not a generalist fund that just knew kind of what does it take to get a company to the next level, from kind of potential idea to product market fit. And we really want just that generalist, like how do you build really good, sustainable foundations for a business? So we were really excited about having that around the room. We really wanted insurtech expertise, and there's a wonderful fund that actually came in very early called Floating Point. That's the founding team from Oscar Health, and now invest in all kinds of sophisticated insurance. And then Lower Carbon, or Lower Case, which is the Lower Carbon is Chris Sacca's kind of climate-specific fund. It was really important to us to have folks who were also very focused on the climate crisis and long-term wanted to invest in things that were solving this problem, would help us direct towards that. Number of other folks around the room who are very good at understanding how to build technology moats around a business that are sustainable, that last for many years, how to recruit the right people, how to make sure the IP is protected, all of that, and like so many other challenges that we get around the room with the investors we have.
Great. And so since we're unfortunately sort of coming to the end here and running short on time, let me ask you a few other sort of closing questions. I forgot to ask at the beginning, Cloud to Street, what's the story behind the name? Who came up with it? Why?
The idea behind Cloud to Street is, first of all, that's how floods happen, but also Cloud to Street flipped the script on how floods are analyzed. Rather than going from the street down using ground equipment, we started really in the wake of the possibility that you could analyze disasters from the cloud down, which just meant it was much more accessible and made planetary scale resilience possible.
Okay, cool. And where are you guys based?
We're based half in New York and then half kind of all over.
Okay, remote. Okay, terrific. Are you guys hiring right now?
We are hiring. Yes, we're primarily hiring, product positions. So we're looking for a VP of product. Very excited. Many of your kind of audiences have startup experience and excellent product folks, and a DevOps engineer.
Okay, terrific. And then one question I always ask is, I know you're obviously super dedicated to Cloud to Street right now, and it really seems like a very fascinating and important business. But if you were forced to do something else, is there some sort of other kind of business idea that's on your mind, or something you thought, somebody should really do this or do it in a better way? Or
it's such an interesting one. So I have always worked on climate change and the climate crisis. And there was a major gap in climate adaptation and resilience building. And so we'll be focused on this laser focused on this till we can build the climate adaptation market. But the next thing I do will definitely still be in climate crisis, like solving the climate crisis. So I'll get back to you about my next big business.
It seems there's probably going to be enough scope, enough task and possibilities to build companies.
Hopefully there's nothing more to do by the time soon.
And then the last question we always ask, because we're primarily a space podcast, is about science fiction and whether you like science fiction and what kind of science fiction. And maybe let me just
I love this question.
We're talking so much about climate, right? Have you happened to read Kim Stanley Robinson Ministry for the Future yet?
Yeah, of course. We actually had a company book club on that book. Yeah, I'm actually we're doing a couple of what's called like cli-fi science fiction, which is I love these kind of near future climate science fiction, which looks at these realistic sort of just following the trends that we have today through logically over the next several decades, and then envisioning what it would take to solve those things. Kim Stanley Robinson is at a very large and deep scale, and someone on my team told me I had to stop reading these books at night, because what I just do is envision what if Cloud to Street and some of the other kind of peer companies in climate climate tech were around in the 30, 40-year future that I'm reading about, how would the future have been different?
Yeah. So besides Ministry for the Future, any other sort of cli-fi works you guys have come across that you'd recommend?
Yeah, I mean, Neil Stephenson has a new one that I'm actually just like halfway in the middle of. And I actually consider Parable of the Sower a cli-fi book. It's Octavia Butler, like one of the greats, and probably not what folks are thinking of when you think of sci-fi. But it's a very intense, but I think like really beautiful book about what it feels like to be in the climate crisis.
Okay, this is great. I learned a new word today, cli-fi. I'm going to start.
Yeah, there you go.
And I feel just like with startups that we need more climate startups. There's probably going to be a lot more cli-fi books in the future
yeah,
too.
Exactly. Yeah. I think they do really inspire people.
Yeah, and they're important also to raise awareness and everything. But in that way, and Bessie, thank you so much for being on the show today. Thank you so much for all the important work you're doing, and all the best to you and Cloud Street.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
And that's a wrap for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. Once more, if you enjoyed this, please leave us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platforms such as Apple or Spotify. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. You can support us at www.patreon.com/Space Business Podcast. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may include yourself if you have an interesting space story to tell, or interested in being a sponsor, drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. See you for the next episode.